Welcome, everybody. The format for this evening will be about an hour or so of a kind of exploratory conversation, followed by 20 minutes to half an hour of questions and interactions with the group here. I've had the opportunity of spending the evening with Carol last night in Edmonton, where we had a similar kind of engagement. And also a trip back on the bus this morning from Edmonton, which is a much preferred way of travel, Carol tells me, than sitting on the confinement, especially those small commuter Air Canada turboprops, which is kind of like sitting in a cigar box for what seems like an infinity. And we've had some wonderful conversations and exploration, and we're going to be building on that here this evening. Some of it I'm going to invite Carol to revisit because they're kind of foundational parts of the story. But I also want to set the frame here, and the reason for inviting Carol is that as you gather from the work that we're doing with leadership programs in Edmonton and Calgary and the work of the Human Venture Institute, is that we are seriously engaged in a process of trying to understand the human condition and how is it that human beings keep doing the same stupid things over and over again throughout history, and are convinced that the reasons for that are discoverable. But they're not discoverable by looking out there. We have to look in here. We have to look at how we work as human beings, how we've been programmed to make sense of the world and ourselves, how we are equipped to take stock of our situations, and what causes us to take stock of ourselves and our situations in ways that include ignorance and error, but that we don't identify as ignorance and error, and in fact are quite resistant to that identification. So that when I first encountered Carol's book, almost immediately after it was published, realized that this was going to be a pivotal book for the program. And as you've heard, I'm sure from others, it is, if you look at my own copy of the book and how it's kind of marked up, you know, always gauge the amount of significance you find in the books in my library by the number of little page markers in it. And this one, it'd probably be easier to mark those pages where there weren't significant things in it.
You promised to tell me what the color coding means.
Yes, that's a long story. So this evening, I'm going to be inviting Carol to share something of her thinking and motivations, given that the kind of inquiry that Carol has spent much of her life doing is, in the view of us doing this work, critical to moving the human venture forward. If we don't understand why human beings don't learn from mistakes, why we avoid facing reality of our own conduct and our situation, we can't learn and we can't correct it. So it is a prerequisite for the rest of the journey. And Carol has spent much of her life trying to understand those dynamics as a social psychologist, and you'll get a flavor of that kind of thinking through our discussion here this evening. But as an introduction, I'm going to ask Carol to share something about the reasons that she and her partner, co-writer Elliot Aronson, chose to write the book in the first place, and the kind of environmental impulse that was there that prompted them to be thinking about why this book would be helpful at this time in history.
Yes, right. Well, Elliot and I have been friends and colleagues for many, many years, and have been in touch over the years as various issues came along. He was one of the people at my side when I got into a little trouble by writing a review that was critical of the incest survivor books like Courage to Heal and Secret Survivors and so forth. This was an article I had written in the New York Times that brought down a hailstorm. Hail, I've learned about hail since I've been here in Calgary. So when I say a hailstorm, it was a hailstorm of criticism and shrieking at me for what I regarded as simply writing an essay with basic findings from Psychology 101 on how memory works and trauma works. Anyway, Eliot had come to my defense at that time, and I mean, we've just been great pals for many years. So we're sitting around not long after it became abundantly clear that George Bush's reason for going into Iraq to get those weapons of mass destruction was completely bogus. And of course, George Bush did not say to the American public, "So sorry that I was wrong in our projections. We really thought that bastard had those weapons of mass destruction, but turns out, no, he really didn't at all. But, okay, but we got rid of a bad guy. That's probably a good thing." So Eliot and I got to talking about this, and he said, you know, I disagree with my liberal friends about Bush because they think that Bush intentionally lied to the American public. And I don't think he intentionally lied to the American public. I think he lied to himself. I think that what he did was just exactly what all of us do when we have made a decision to do something and then cherry pick the evidence to support our decision to do that, and don't want to hear from the naysayers and the critics and others. And of course, we have learned since, in the last few years, as members of Bush's inner circle have written their own books about this, that that's precisely what Bush did. He ignored the warnings from his own intelligence agencies that the evidence was not conclusive. He ignored the warnings and naysayers that he would be destabilizing this country, that we weren't going to be greeted with roses and dancing in the streets. For whatever reason, George Bush wanted to go into Iraq and found the reasons to do it. And when he was wrong, he did also what the rest of us do, usually on a smaller scale than starting a war, but we justify the thing that we did that has turned out to be disastrously flat out wrong. Well, okay, so he became an alcoholic, but really he's so charming when he's drunk, you know, whatever it might be. Now, so as we got to talking about this, I want you to understand, I mean, Eliot's work as a social psychologist, he's one of the greatest social psychologists the field has produced, and he has always had a passion for doing the great science and then doing great science that can be brought into everyday life, that can be made useful in people's private lives and on a larger scale for our society. All of his work has had both of those prongs. But cognitive dissonance never quite made it into the public sphere, although the term was in vogue, turns up in a lot of places all the time. I mean, Jon Stewart on his show uses it all the time. But the public didn't really have a good grasp of what this concept meant. And what was important in it for Eliot was his mentor, Leon Festinger, who came up with the theory of dissonance and was a pure scientist. I don't care if anything has any relevance for anything. I'm interested in the science. Eliot took Festinger's theory of cognitive dissonance and transformed it in his own elegant experiments into a theory of self-justification, meaning that dissonance is uncomfortable when you and your best friend disagree about Woody Allen movies. You'd really like your friend to have your opinion. It's not important, though. You could live with this forever. But when the dissonant information contradicts something central to our self-concept, that is when we will be most motivated to justify the thing we've done and ignore the evidence that we don't want to hear. The self-concept is primary. I mean, Eliot did this lovely little study showing that people with a low self-concept, people who think I'm no damn good, and nothing you tell me will convince me otherwise. I mean, as we say in the book, you know, but you won the Pulitzer Prize, doesn't that help? You know, and the person will say, no, it was just a fluke, you know, they gave it to me because no one else was in the room. I mean, no, it'll never happen again, I'll never write another word, you'll see. So as you know, I mean, when somebody has really got a low self-concept, it's very hard for evidence to change their point of view. But most people have a reasonably strong sense of self-esteem. We think of ourselves as good, kind, ethical, smart, competent people. And we believe that, you know, because I'm smart, good, and competent, if I can just get Ken here to sit down and listen to me while I explain to him why I'm right and he's not, he'll believe me because I'm a smart, capable, ethical person. And if he doesn't believe me, it's because there's something the matter with him. He's biased, or he's mean, or perhaps he's ignorant and foolish. Otherwise, why would I hold the ideas that I hold? So Eliot's talking to me about this, about Bush and self-justification and this massive lie that Bush was perpetrating on himself that was the paradigm for how we all operate. And I said, you know, this is a theory that helps me understand why in my entire life's work of gently pointing out to people that the evidence disputes their belief, and people so rarely say, "Oh, thank you, Carol, for pointing this out to me. I'm so grateful for your evidence." Mostly, they have sent messages to me wishing that I have a pleasant sexual experience by myself. So I'm listening to Eliot and thinking, okay, because the themes in my life work have been, because I love science, I love psychological science. My life work has been designed to show that psychological science isn't an oxymoron, a contradiction in terms, you know, like military intelligence. And so we got into discussion of all the fields, all the areas in which I'd had this experience, whether it was writing about recovered memory or the reason that prosecutors, when faced with DNA evidence that they put an innocent man in prison for 20 years, don't say, "Thank God for this evidence. Where would we have been without DNA? How soon can we get this innocent guy out of there?" They find another reason to keep the guy in prison. So we came up then with the construct for this book. It would be his beautiful research, this important concept, and then show how it applied in so many domains of our lives, from our private personal lives to the world stage. And we had such an interesting time doing this. I loved working with him. He's so knowledgeable and such a good teacher, you know, even one-to-one, and he loved the stories and articles that I came up with, and it was a phenomenal experience. But I don't think that either of us had a sense that it would be received the way it has been.
Mm-hmm.
That was a big delight to us.
And I understand from our conversation last night that the book has been published now in 13 languages?
13, including French.
Okay. Which was a big surprise because?
Oh, the big, I said last night, yes, the French publisher in France said the book has had virtually no sales. Here in France, apparently the French do not think they ever make mistakes.
And if you get a chance to visit the French War Museum in Paris and you take a look at the history of the French wars, and you note that there are no wars the French lost. And if you ask that question, they will point out that they don't keep those in their history. There's no point in doing that. So
well, look at the American Civil War. The South is still fighting it.
It's true.
The South is still fighting that war. Yes.
Can you recall, and even if you can't, can you invent something from your early life experience that pointed you in the direction of a drive to understand the human mind and how it is formed and shaped?
Oh, excellently interesting. I was thinking about this the other day, actually. I can tell you the first story that illustrates my love of science, or my incipient love of science. When I was very young, I don't know how young, really young, I called a family meeting. I was an only child. And my parents were very progressive and thought we're going to have a little democracy here. You don't get an equal say, but you get to, anyway, I called a meeting and I said, I have a complaint, which is that the two of you are going out all the time and leaving me all alone. All right, now, the problem here was my parents didn't have any money. They were not going out all the time. They were not leaving me alone, but with my beloved grandmother. So what was I unhappy about? Maybe, my mother thinks, maybe they had gone out twice in a row, some family thing, something took them away for maybe, it was the 2 nights in a row that must have upset me. So this is my parents, see, critical thinking. It was an early lesson. They didn't say, oh, be quiet and you're wrong. They said, well, do you think we should never go out without you? And I said, well, no, that wouldn't be fair. Okay, they said, well, how often do you think it would be okay for us to go out without you? And I said, no more than 4 or 5 times a week. Because they were going out all the time, right? So 4 or 5. So my mother said, all right, suppose we agree on 4. And what happens if a very special event comes up on the 5th night? She was good, my mom, you know. I said, well, you'll have to come and ask me, and I'll probably give you permission, but you should come and ask. I mean, why they didn't swat me down right there, I don't know. Okay, now the point of this story is this. We have this conversation, yeah? My parents must have thought this was just hilariously amusing. My mother discovered, I don't know, a couple of weeks later, that I was keeping a little record. I wanted the data. I wanted the numbers. How often were they going out? 0, 0, 0. 14 years later, well, I don't know how long I kept this for. My mother was just fascinated that I was actually collecting data. Now, we could say, looking back, this indicated some love of evidence, or maybe my first experience with dissonance, that I was wrong and my parents were right. But that was one thing. I loved the idea that you could know things. You could know things. And then in junior high school, I mean, this is a story from the first chapter of the book, is the story of Ignaz Semmelweis. But it's not the story of Semmelweis itself. It was my experience with that story. When I was in middle school, grade 9, 8 or 9, I had a wonderful science teacher who told us the story of Ignaz Semmelweis. Everybody remember Ignaz Semmelweis? Chapter 1. Semmelweis was a Hungarian physician in Vienna in the mid-1800s when women were dying in droves of childbed fever. It was horrible. It was an epidemic in some of the years in that mid-century. I mean, huge percentages of women were dying in childbirth. And Semmelweis had the idea as a physician that the reason they were dying is that the physicians were coming from the morgue where they were doing autopsies on the patients who had died and coming directly to the bedsides of the women they were delivering. And he thought, he didn't know about germs, but he thought maybe they're carrying, he called it a morbid poison, from the autopsy to the delivery room. That's the hypothesis. So his suggestion was to his colleagues, wash your hands. He instructed his own medical students, wash your hands in antiseptic chlorine solution. And the patients of his students didn't die. They had the most powerful data that you could possibly have. Your patients aren't dying. Now, when our science teacher told us his story, he told this to us as an example of science. See, there's a problem, a serious problem. You come up with a hypothesis, you investigate it, you try an intervention, you see if this works, and look, it did. And I said, what about his colleagues? Because Semmelweis's colleagues didn't say, thank you, Ignaz, for this really fantastic finding. We are so grateful. Now we can save our patients' lives. Boy, that was a brilliant idea. They said, oh, piss off and take your stupid, you're telling us that we are killing our patients? You're telling us we are good, smart, compassionate, competent physicians, and you Hungarian nutnik, you're telling us that we're killing our patients? So they didn't listen to him. They didn't listen to him. And I said to my beloved teacher, why not? The question that became my life's question, why not? Why wouldn't they listen to him? I will tell you, anybody who knows this story will say, well, Semmelweis had the temper of a rattlesnake and he was a pretty difficult guy to deal with. But you know what? His patients weren't dying. His patients weren't dying. So You know what? In my lifetime, the sort of those themes of understanding these mysterious things that people do, that are universal, that have benefits, that wouldn't be nice if we understood them and could do something about them, and that's really been a driving curiosity for me.
That's good. It highlights what is so often the case, that there's a combination of driving forces or motivators in play that shapes a person's life path. But I think there are lots of people who are fascinated by science, not so many who are fascinated with social justice and reducing waste and suffering. And it would appear that there was not only this love of science, but also something very significant in the way you reacted to waste and suffering. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about where that came from, or when it showed up and how.
Sure. That came from my family life. My mother became a lawyer in Chicago in 1927 when she was 21 years old. She was 5 foot tall. She was Jewish at a time of massive anti-Semitism. She was feisty, and she was the most persuasive person on the planet. She was kind and deft, and she knew how to persuade people out of their prejudices before they even knew they were in them, you know? So for instance, she had a job, she applied for a job, been working her way through law school, and she applied for a job as a secretary in a company, and the employer said, okay, you know, I'm happy to hire you. He said, that'll be great, you know, can you start Monday? And fine. And then he said, you're not Jewish, are you? And my mother said, well, yes, I am. Why? Does that matter? Right, he said, well, yeah, well, we don't hire Jews. Why? Said my mother, kind of that way. Well, Jews, you know, they're very noisy. So my mother said, at that moment, the voice of the Irish office manager excoriating a customer came wafting into the office, and my mother said, it's a good policy. I see you've hired one already. So of course she got the job. I mean, she was just like that. Okay, but my mother and father, both of them had been political activists. Both of them had been socialists. They had come out to California during the Depression, figuring they'd be poor but warm. And after the war, when the McCarthy era swept the United States with such a vengeance, we were living in Los Angeles, and although my parents weren't in the entertainment business, they were both at that time insurance agents, we knew a lot of people who were blacklisted. We knew scientists who'd been blacklisted. We knew teachers, high school teachers, elementary school teachers, college teachers who'd been blacklisted, scientists who'd lost their jobs, as well as people in Hollywood in the movie business. And they'd come to our house late at night and be discussing, are we going to move to France? Are we moving to Mexico? Are we going to Canada? Where are we going to go? How are we going to live? Are we going to go to prison? How do I name names to the House Un-American Activities Committee? The anguish of those discussions, I was a kid, but I remember listening to them. And years later, another child of the blacklist, he and I were talking about our memories of those times, and he said, I remember the whispering. And the minute he said that, I remembered it too. The adults would be whispering, so we wouldn't hear and be worried. But of course we were worried because they were whispering. You know, it was such an eerie sound to have the grown-ups whispering. Are they going to move? Are they not going to move? Anyway, so my parents had a very strong sense of justice. Boy, it's funny that you asked this. How might this be related to my life work? When I was 8 years old, my mother called me over to her in the living room and she said, honey, you need to be here for this, she said. The FBI is coming to our door. So the FBI, in those days, harassing, of course, everybody who was of the left-wing persuasion, they always came in twos, they always wore ties, and they always wore hats. No one in California, even then, wore hats and ties. They wore hats and ties. And they came to the front door. My mother had a screen door which was locked. And they came to the front door and they said to my mother, "Mrs. Tavris." "Yes." "May we come in? We have a few questions for you." "Oh," she said, "what about? What is this about? Do you have a warrant? Do you have a..." "No, we just want to ask you a few questions." "Oh," she said, what about?" "Well, you know, just about your citizenship and your papers and so forth." She said, "If you really are, as you say, from the FBI, then you know that I am a citizen of the United States." And she closed the door on them. Yes. Then she went and collapsed on the sofa. But that's who she was. That's who my father was. They didn't, as you can see, I'm just immensely proud of those people and of their commitment to, you do for your friends, you do for your friends, you do for the people who might go to prison. You know, men used to come and talk to my father and say, "I have to name names, I have to name names, I have a family to support." And my father would say, "Well, of course, then you must. You're the only man in Los Angeles with a family to support." They understood the consequences of their actions, but they taught me two things, that you never win for once and for all. You never win for once and for all. It's precarious. Every battle you do win, you'll lose a lot of them, and then you keep going.
Very relevant and insightful and helpful. Understanding dissonance, understanding how we construct our meaning and how we come to terms with errors has to be put into a context of life learning and the life journey, and our ability to recognize errors and injustices and then choose to do something about them, but also to recognize that it's not just our understanding that's important, it's the understanding of the people around us. We use this phrase to describe our programs sometimes, that it's a combination of horse whispering and bomb disposal. And the horse whispering is to focus on the fact that it's not just what you can see, it's also what the people you're working with can see and feel and appreciate. And that in your communication to them, you have to try to understand how they are understanding you in such a way that they are not feeling fear or aggression or dismissal, so that they're more willing to work with you and want to work with you. And it sounds like your parents had that kind of sensitivity, that sense of other sight, where you're able to anticipate something about how other people will be interpreting what it is you're saying, which strikes me as being one of the fundamental problems with progressives generally. Anyone who has a belief in empiricism and science and logic and rationality tends to have an overestimation of the impact of a rational argument on others, and assume that they will be easily persuaded by the data.
Just by the data and by my general all-around rightness.
Exactly, that's right. It's bleeding obvious. How could you not see this? Of course. But that combination of a sensitivity and a level of compassion that must come with it, where you recognize that it is difficult for people to come to terms with their errors and their ignorance and their incompleteness, and that their beliefs may be wrongly held or unjustified, and to recognize that the process of undoing that and moving beyond it is a gradual learning process that requires a level of respect for the humanity of the other. And I sense that in you, and I can see that it's very clearly there in your parents. And I'm wondering if you spend some time kind of exploring that side of the story.
Well, you know, see, there's two elements of here, especially about social change, because, and I would say my parents were harmonious about this, but also very different. You see, where my mother was the persuade, seduce, charm, reason, get you on her side because of her incredible sweetness and reason. My father was, I don't know what I'm doing. This is just metaphor. My father never hit anybody, but okay. But my father could be really angry. I mean, my mother could be angry, but my father would use anger for angry purposes. And it's probably not coincidental that my first book was about anger and its uses and misuses. And it's actually the same paradigm with cognitive dissonance in this sense, as Elliot and I talked about very often. Because people often say, well, what can we do about this? If dissonance is universal, you know, how do we get people to change, blah, blah. And he would say, you know, we can come up with a lot of ways in which we as individuals can learn to recognize dissonance in ourselves, see it coming, hit it off at the pass, learn to live with it, moderate it. We really can. It's one of the few blind spots in human thinking that when you really get how it works, you can really do something about it. I've had, you know, one-on-one training from Elliot, you know, and he's really good, you know, at helping me see this and understand this. But at a social level, you cannot wait around for miraculous individual changes, for individuals in a legal system to say, oh, I was wrong, or in whatever the system was. And so in those situations, then we have to work to make sure there are oversight systems in place to correct the errors of people underneath you. So for example, the Central Park jogger case in New York City, did this make its way to Canada? This poor woman who was savagely raped in Central Park, and 5 young black men were sent to prison, and they were completely innocent, completely innocent. To this day, the police who interrogated them and who testified against them, the prosecutor who put them in prison, all still believe that these young men were guilty. They still believe it, even though the actual rapist confessed. Confessed! Okay, now, that mistake was not corrected by the men who made it. It was Robert Morgenthau coming in above them as the city district attorney who said, we're going to correct this. And around the country in the United States where the most egregious criminal mistakes that have been made, they're almost never corrected by the people who made them. So in the same way, in companies, in hospitals, in any organizational setting where somebody who makes a mistake will be deeply motivated to protect themselves, either because they fear losing their job or they fear losing face, then there has to be a system in place to make sure that those corrections are made. So it's the same thing in a way with anger, you know. There is a time and a place for reasonable, calm discussions of why I'm angry and what is unjust here and what is unfair and what we can do about it. And there's a time for roaring. Depends on the thing you're trying to gain, to be able to then say, what is the best way to get this? And that requires putting a little distance between how you feel and the outcome you want. That's the hard part, the counting to 10 part.
Yes, and then reflecting on how it came to be that way, in a way where you are angry, you see the injustice, you see the willful ignorance, and recognize that you have to deal with the acute situation.
Wait, you just said something really important, willful ignorance.
Yes.
See, it is a milestone, a hailstone? a milestone?
Probably both.
It's probably both.
Yeah.
When you realize that the other side isn't evil,
Yes.
but ignorant.
Yes.
This is a massively important reassessment, because if you think the other side, sometimes they may be just plain being mean,
Yeah.
but very often they're defending a position out of ignorance and of self-protectiveness and not malevolence.
This is good, and it is something that we recognize in human venture learning. We draw on human history and the different ways that human beings have characterized the nature of good and evil. Where in a Buddhist tradition, they don't talk about it that way. It's enlightenment and ignorance, which fits much better with a human venture approach, because when you recognize that human beings live what they learn, how they're programmed, and that our programming does not equip us to understand the complexities of reality or ourselves well. So people are doing the best with what they've got, and unfortunately it's not very good or not adequate often, and it doesn't help to simply label people. We have to figure out then what are the influences that are in place, the institutional background, their life experience, their parenting, their families, their communities, that equip them to think, care, learn, and act in the way that they are. And if it's a very limited horizon and they're only sampling a few things and only care about a few things and missing some other much more important things, all of that's discoverable, which I take as being the essence of social psychology, is that sort of mix of looking at the individual meaning-making capacities and the environment, the social context, and the complexities of that arrangement, which then...
Well, complexity is the key word. You know, as you and I have discussed, to me, one of the great insights and contributions of social psychology is to understand that all of the qualities of the human being, competition, cooperation, generosity, selfishness, name the dimension, it's not that we're naturally one thing and the other thing is unnatural. You know, we're all basically really good, decent, honest people, but on occasion we behave in a bad, corrupt way. Or no, we're all actually basically corrupt, nasty, and mean, and occasionally we behave in a good, kind way. This is not the way to frame the issue. Human beings have the capacity for all of these qualities, and even one of the most interesting things to me is that as we're learning some of the basic social and cognitive processes in social psychology, like social identity, cognitive dissonance, empathy, name the quality. And what we've learned is that there's an upside to it and a downside to it. So social identities, for example, it's really important for us to feel that we're a member of a group. We would otherwise feel like we were rattling around somehow in the universe. We have groups. You can create a group in 10 seconds, you know, in the laboratory. There's a group here and a group there. Okay, you guys, go to it. You know, and pretty soon the people in the green lights and the people in the dark lights will be fighting with each other. It's a natural thing to do, to divide ourselves into groups and to identify ourselves that way. And it's functional, it's adaptive, it's healthy, it's human. We are raised in groups, we need groups, we live by groups. What's the downside? Conformity, rigidity, hating the out group, hating those other people who aren't like us. One of the funniest set of findings, I love this, is about the discovery of mirror neurons. Everybody know about mirror neurons? It's such an interesting thing, you know, your neurons fire when you're just watching another person, you know, doing something. This is thought to be the neurological basis of empathy and so forth. And immediately the pop psych writers went to town on this. Women have more mirror neurons than men do. This is why women are more empathic. No data for this, none, zero. So, you know, everybody's going on about mirror neurons. Well, it turns out that mirror neurons go to sleep when a person is looking at a member of an out group. They function when you're looking, you know, looking at somebody who's like me, you know. If it's my enemy, I'm not so empathic toward you, okay? So at even a biological level, a social level, a psychological level, the idea that some process is always good or always bad is mistaken. So cognitive dissonance, as Eliot said, cognitive dissonance is a good thing. It's what allows us to sleep at night. I mean, and many people don't sleep at night after they've made some decision and they've got buyer's remorse. If you've ever had buyer's remorse or you've had sleepless nights because you couldn't resolve a decision you've made, then you understand the benefits of cognitive dissonance reduction. It's beneficial. It's a good thing. It keeps us pleased with our choices and our actions. We can't stop every 5 seconds and think, is it wise for me to be brushing my teeth? Where are the data here? You know, I mean, some things we just have to do automatically. But we wrote a whole book about the downside of cognitive dissonance. So all of these processes, it's adaptive. It's beneficial for us to be irrational, to believe some things without evidence, because other people in our group believe it. Beneficial. We can't pause to get information on every single thing that we believe, know, and do. What's the downside?
And a huge downside, of course, that's, yes, and
That's
sort of
his
chomping at the bit here. There's a huge downside to making your way through the world by navigating in such a way that you prefer the confirmation or consonant information, not for everyone clearly, but that people in positions of responsibility for community, for the lives and welfare of others, where the decisions they make and the policies they put in place have an impact on the lives and future of others. In our view, these individuals have a tremendous responsibility of a duty of inquiry, where they are looking for ignorance and error in their own understanding, and that they're able to change course as they go, so that they aren't doing what one cognitive researcher had identified as the difference between ballistic decision making, which is once the decision has been made, it's been launched, and it's like a projectile, it's in the air, it's gone, and there's no way of changing it, and you stick with it till the end. And then the adaptable decision making, where you're recognizing the need to hold your views provisionally and to test them and to be aware that you may be wrong, and to recognize the importance of understanding proportionality of issue, and kind of a triage of those things that you really do have to exercise that duty of inquiry around, because the consequences of an error are going to be catastrophic potentially, and those issues where brushing your teeth once a day, 6 times a day, may or may not have a very severe consequence for very many people. So it's that sense of understanding about what is significant in life and what is not so significant is critically important. And it seems to be flattened in our society, where because people are raised in this highly institutionalized environment, highly standardized, with very little in the way of real responsibility for their actions and outcomes, so much of that is externally programmed, that they don't appear to have much of an appreciation for how to establish proportionality around decision making, so that every decision is like a consumer choice, and it's just what your preference is for a particular kind of soap with perfume or without, so that even your political choices boil down to a matter of personal preference, and that there is really no functional difference between reactionary conservatives that are closed-minded and are insistent on conformity to their particular agenda and intolerance of diversity, versus a more progressive approach that's more open and willing to course correct and more open to diversity, as though that were simply a matter of personal preference, like the color of the outfit that you wear.
That's right.
And not seeing that there is a fundamental adaptive constraint in being closed,
Exactly.
and an adaptive advantage to being open.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
And it's you know, one of the promises, I think, of the kind of work that you've been engaged in, and of course the work that we see being done increasingly around the world, the investigation into human thought and learning, and cognitive science, and natural history, where we're beginning to understand that human beings are animals, and that we have all of the advantages and disadvantages of being small troop primates, and that helps to explain an awful lot about the nature of our behavior. But we've got far more data now to draw on than we ever have had before about what it means to be alive and human. I think a big part of the problem, though, is the integration of all of that at the personal level, where people are able to take that and use it as a way of guiding their own journey of self-realization and discovery. Have you got some recommendations, some examples, some from your own experience, observations around how people do that, how we can use the insights of social psychology, of cognitive science, of human history to use it to become better human beings? I would ask, as part of that story, when you highlight the difference between Eliot and Leon Festinger, and the difference between basic science and applied science, and had been my experience in studying psychology, that no psychologist that I knew at university was at all interested in people becoming better human beings. They weren't interested in it at all. There was not on the agenda, no discussion. And in fact, so many of the psychologists I knew were pretty screwed up people. This is not a...
I went to a different school.
Went to a different school. But there is something about that kind of academic specialization where you develop your status and your confidence about being an expert in a very, very narrow field, but then having the aura of significance in that you're associated somehow with really studying the human mind, which is at the base of everything.
Well, that's why they say the battles are so bitter because the stakes are so low.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Using the insights of psychological science to become better human beings? I think there are many. I think psychological science really has provided some very good, I wouldn't say, I mean, insight is a word that implies an intuitive impression of things. But I would say, no, psychological science has given us some good guidelines. I don't like that word either. I can only think of this in a kind of almost topic by topic way. For example, we learn that we're better at changing ourselves and fixing ourselves, making our own positions clear, than the usual thing that human beings try to do with each other in intimate relationships or with their children or with their parents, which is changing everybody else. Okay. An understanding of a family systems approach in a family, that families get into a little dance, and the dance embeds everybody, in those steps. And so for you to change means understanding if you change yourself, everybody is going to try to get you to be doing the same dance again, and they're going to be yelling at you even more. Maybe you weren't listening to the music, and to try to get you back, whether it's your family group or a friend group or whatever the group is. If you want to change in some way, the people around you are going to want to try to change you back. And so one deep understanding of social psychology is that we don't make changes in ourselves and by ourselves alone, and that we're not affected by how others then react to us. It's one of the reasons that people can go off for encounter group weekends and feel, I'm a new person now, I've changed everything, and now I endeavor to be X, Y, and Z, find themselves in the same environment and the same behavior returns. So one important focus of deep understanding is the nature of the groups that we're in and their influence on us. Second, that we can change our own behavior. I think this is most powerfully illustrated to me in my book on anger. How many people I heard from who said, I felt I was entitled to be angry, I was angry, I let everybody around me know how angry I was, I made their lives hell. And that's not a way to be. So, see, when you say these are insights, This is a way of saying I can stop dead in my tracks and look at my behavior and say, I'm doing these things that are harming everybody around me, and I don't need to do that, and I can stop doing that. That's powerful, and that's from an understanding of the context. When I wrote that book on anger, the discussions about anger were almost entirely clinical and psychodynamic, and sort of, anger is in you like a turnip. People are always uprooting their anger and digging it up. They have these metaphors, but it's not. Anger is a transaction. Hardly anybody sits there on their sofa in their living room just being angry. You're angry as soon as it needs another person to walk in there for you to yell at them. And so by understanding that anger is a transaction, then we're better able to see, okay, what is it I want to get by being angry? Do I want a trip to Tahiti? Do I want the other person to apologize? Do I want behavior to change? Do I want him to pick up his socks? What do I want here? And is being angry the best way to get that? So by understanding the consequences of how we express our feelings, whom they fall on, with what result, we can begin to make changes. And then, of course, there are the lifelong changes, the things for which science has no answer, but life teaches. And that comes from perspective, I guess. Being able to look at yourself honestly, see where the flaws are, where the fears are.
And a sense of responsibility to do that. In Eliot's biography, he talks about the difference between clinical psychology and social psychology. Clinical psychology being focused on repair, and that social psychology was about becoming, about change, about and that speaks to a fundamental of our work, an understanding of the nature of agency and recognizing the importance of becoming self-authorized in your own life journey, but learning how to become self-authorized in ways that are increasingly responsible, that you are drawing on sources that will help you navigate your life journey, exercising and extending your agency in increasingly responsible, wiser ways. But the first step in that is just to recognize that you do have agency, you have a choice.
And it's seeing our part in our own life story. I had a half-brother much older than I who used to talk about the stepfather who raised him. And it was always, he was mean to me. He was stern with me. He was too disciplined. It was always, my stepfather did these things to me. Never once in his story did he say, I was a difficult kid who caused him to do these things to me. His part of the story was written out. This is the way many people tell their life story. These are the things that happened to me. And actually in narrative therapy, the point is to get people to tell a better life story, a more honest life story, a more positive life story. Not that I was a victim of all these horrible things, but look, I survived being a victim of all of these things. And what does that tell me about who I am? And so it is, George Gerbner used to say, human beings, the only thing that differentiates us from other species is that we're the only animal that tells stories and lives by the stories we tell. I love that. And that's exactly the point. We tell a story, I'm this way because of my genes, of my upbringing, of the world, of my ethnicity, whatever it is. And then if that's the only story we tell, that's going to be the story we live by.
Mm-hmm. And it's a phrase we use often, that we don't have beliefs or stories, our stories have us, if we are not careful in how we construct them, and that's critical. Now, before we wrap it up here this evening, there's two more things that I want to touch on briefly. One is your book, The Mismeasure of Women, and that I know that there's a fair bit of interest in this group in that whole area of gender comparisons and gender competencies. So just a little bit of background about writing the book, and even just an explanation of the reason for the title and subtitle.
The title and subtitle, oh sure. Okay, Stephen Jay Gould, the great biologist, wrote a book called The Mismeasure of Man, which he took from Protagoras' great line, "Man is the measure of all things." And Stephen Jay Gould's book was about the way science had been misused in the study of racial differences in intelligence, in particular, the mismeasure of man. So I thought, I want to write a book about the way science has been misused in the study of gender. And the subtitle, so I'm going to call it The Mismeasure of Woman. And I write to Stephen Jay Gould and I say, can I, use this title? And he said, you can call your book War and Peace. Titles aren't copyrightable. You can call your book anything you want, and so forth. And he loved it, actually, that I was doing this book, and we began a great correspondence. The subtitle is Why Women Are Not the Better Sex, the Inferior Sex, or the Opposite Sex. It's really a better title than the title, because it's about how our notions of gender have always been based on one sex being the normal sex. As soon as one sex is normal, the sex being compared is different. Okay, well, are we going to see those differences as better? Women are kinder, cuter, warmer, more compassionate, and more all-around adorable. Women are more stupid, incompetent, negative, bad at science and math and stuff, okay? Whenever one sex is the normal sex in the family, women have been taken as the normal sex in love and intimacy and conversation and how to talk. And men are the louts, because men don't talk the way women do, or they don't have the same notions about communication that women do. So men just don't know how to do it. Or women are the real friends, men don't know how to be friends. Whatever the going comparison is, okay? And in my lifetime, there have been many different ones. So I wrote this book about the way science bends to our stereotypes and expectations about gender, and at the same time tried to show what the research really showed about where the differences are, what the differences mean, what we know, what we don't know. I'm happy to report that since writing that book, I've had many experiences of dissonance as I've learned how wrong I was in some of those chapters, but also some of it could have been written yesterday afternoon at 4 o'clock, frankly. So that book had a long life. I think it was one of the first books to welcome men into the conversation about gender. I heard from lots and lots of men saying, oh, thank you, we were just feeling that nobody wanted to hear from us, nobody cared. As soon as I got to your chapter that women aren't the better sex, I could relax. It's not going to be another slam at men, So it was just, it was about why it is that when we take a snapshot of men and women at any moment in time and find differences, and whatever the difference might be, percentage of women bartenders, percentage of women in science, whatever the difference, that we think that that snapshot is a blueprint, that it's unchanging, that it tells us something about our inherent natures. And I'll tell you, I've been at this long enough to know that so much has changed, certainly so much since my mother's and father's time, that to think of these differences as blueprints is not helpful. My darling husband, who was Irish, Ronan O'Casey, came from a feminist Irish family. His Aunt Hannah Sheehy married Frank Skeffington in 1903, and they became Sheehy-Skeffington. They took each other's names, and Frank wore a Votes for Women badge in 1903, fighting for women's suffrage until his death at the hands of a crazy British officer in 1916. Feminism, equality, the long march for our shared humanity the title of my very first book in women's studies was The Longest War. And that is what it is. But we've had many, many successes along the way.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
I had asked you on our initial telephone meeting conversation to reflect on how you'd approach the question, what does it mean to be alive and human? And you offered to share a poem last night in Edmonton that spoke to that for you. And in our conversations on the ride back on the bus, you'd been reflecting on that poem and its fit, and decided that maybe there was another poem that might be worth sharing as an indicator of the kind of thinking that you do when you're thinking about what it means to be alive and human. So if you would honor us with sharing that poem
It's not
now.
by me. A poem was written, but not by me. Well, so I have these two. You want the Robert Frost?
Sure. But
Sure.
and it's your choice. And in fact, you're welcome to share
You
both.
want the Edmonton poem, or do you want tonight's own unique
Both.
poem? Both, you
That's
greedy
fine.
lot. Okay.
Yes. We're in
Yeah.
the group. Yeah, we're inclusive.
All right, because they're good and they're short. Okay, this one is for mistakes were made. Someone sent this to Elliot and me, and I just love it. The poem is called Thanks, Robert Frost, by David Ray. Do you have hope for the future? Someone asked Robert Frost toward the end. Yes, he said, and even for the past, that it will turn out to have been all right for what it was, something we can accept. Mistakes made by the selves we had to be, not able to be perhaps what we wished, or what, looking back, half the time it seems we so easily could have been, or ought to have been. I have hope for the future, yes, and even for the past, that it will become something we can bear. And I too, and my children, so I hope, will recall as not too heavy the tug of those albatrosses I sadly placed upon their tender necks. Hope for the past. Yes, old Frost, your words provide that courage, and it brings strange peace that itself passes into past, easier to bear because you said it rather casually as snow went on falling in Vermont years ago. Hope for the past. What a beautiful notion of accepting, as this says, mistakes made by the selves we had to be. Oh, how self-forgiving that is. Elliot and I, when we finished our book, he said, there's something else I would like to tell audiences, but not until they get this dissonance part right. He said, and that's self-forgiveness. Because once we've admitted where we went wrong, or really awful mistakes that we made, or harms that we caused others, you don't want to jump too soon into, okay, I feel better now. I mean, in other words, you need to process, you need to understand the nature of this mistake so that in fact we learn from it, so that we learn from it. Anyway, I just love that one. Okay, so the other one is this one. Nope. Where are you? Ah. This one knocks me out. This is called Wild Geese by Mary Oliver. I'd asked Elliot Ken's question, what does it mean to be alive in this world now? And he reminded me of this poem that had meant much to me. All right. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over announcing your place in the family of things.
It's wonderful.
Isn't it wonderful? There you are.
Thank you very much for
You're
that.
very welcome. And thank you to this audience, too.